So I'll speak a few minutes about how coronavirus has affected the social, political, and economic stability within Israel specifically, and maybe put that a little bit into a regional context a little bit. So Israel is a bit of an interesting case because coronavirus arrived at a very precarious time for Israel in terms of its political map at the time. As maybe you've followed, Israel has had 3 elections in the last year, and when Corona started to spread and become a threat in the Middle East and in Europe and in the West, this was right at the time when there were very difficult negotiations following the third election, um, where it was not clear that a government would be formed, and there was a possibility that there could actually be a fourth election. And ironically, in some ways in Israel, coronavirus actually brought about political stability in some ways because it gave the the politician, the head of the Blue and White Party, Benny Gantz, the impetus or the excuse, some may say, to basically um, renege on his promise not to sit in a government under the prime ministership under the premiership of Benjamin Netanyahu, because Netanyahu is facing has 3 indictments against him for various corruption um, scandals, and he will be starting the trial actually later this month, towards the end of May. But because there was an emergency situation, or at least a supposed emergency situation, Gantz was able to, or decided to basically give in on that election promise and create a unity government, which they've called a national emergency government, uh, where Netanyahu is the prime minister for a year and a half, and Gantz will be prime minister after 18 months for another year and a half. We'll see if that actually happens. There's a lot of skepticism whether that rotation will actually take place. But this resulted in a kind of a reshuffling of the political map. The Blue and White Party, led by Gantz, split into two, with Yair Lapid's faction deciding not to join. But ironically, in a way, the coronavirus created a sense of political stability, mainly because, I mean, maybe for 2 reasons, that Gantz couldn't take the idea of having some level of responsibility to pushing Israel towards a fourth election under the given situation where the economy is in a terrible situation, the coronavirus causing many sick people, many deaths, the health system being under pressure. I mean, this was right at the height of the virus. Now things have calmed down to some extent, and some of the restrictions have loosened as the numbers have been contained. But the emergency situation did seem quite acute in March and April, which created a situation where there would be this kind of political stability, whether you like it or not. Many think that Gantz made a huge mistake, and basically, those who voted against Netanyahu, that their votes have been somehow taken towards supporting, at least for the first 18 months, a Netanyahu-run government. So on the political level, the ongoing chaos which has existed for the last year basically has been ended, and there is some sense of political stability. It's not very clear what the real policy of this government will be. It's predominantly a right-wing religious government, aside from Gantz's party, which is more centrist. But it's a little bit hard to say what their policy will be at this point. Their first order of business is obviously dealing with coronavirus and trying to get the economy back in a positive direction after all of the economic fallout of the coronavirus. Now, if we look at the economic fallout, I mean, we had here one of the things that the government has actually been praised for, at least in some circles, is that quite early there was a big shutdown here in terms of stopping international travel, um, shutting down businesses, shutting down schools, and really making people very much constricted to their homes or to a 100-meter radius from their homes. And everything was very much shut down for quite a period. Now they've been opened up, but of course this has had a massive effect on the economy. And the fallout of this is not, we haven't reached the end of it. Obviously, this will last for, for a period of time. There are forecasts that approximately 70,000 businesses in Israel are forecast to close by the end of the year, which is quite an astounding number. Specifically, small businesses are being affected drastically. Definitely, I mean, Israel is to a large extent a service-based economy. So all of these kinds of service-based industries like restaurants, the tourism industry, hotels, and everything that's associated with that have been deeply, deeply affected by coronavirus. And it's very hard to see how this will end in terms of the long-term effect on the economy. There has been, there are grants being provided for small businesses, and a lot of people approximately 1 million people are now on unemployment insurance. This is a country of only 9 million citizens. So it's quite astounding in terms of the economic ramifications. But Israel, it does have a reasonable social security safety net, where even if the bureaucracy is taking time, and people are quite frustrated by that, I think that the social security system will allow people to survive this period, even if many businesses will go under and people will have to sort of rethink their economic possibilities. I don't personally foresee the economic instability causing political instability. I don't see a situation necessarily where people will, take to the streets and call for an overthrow of the government. It's not really in our DNA. Like maybe there have been in various surrounding countries, like with the Arab Spring and issues like that, where socioeconomic policies or corruption and these kinds of things cause people to depose of a government or a president or a leader. I don't see that happening here. People may take to the streets and demand various benefits, but I don't see it getting out of control. In terms of, let's say, the geopolitical situation, in many ways, the coronavirus has resulted in at least temporarily, a kind of a safer security situation. This is not necessarily just the case in Israel, but there's been, less terrorism, less missiles being shot from Gaza and this kind of thing, or there haven't been any really in the last while. And I think that this is part of, in a way, a global trend. We've seen similar kind of quote unquote ceasefires in various other locations where various countries and states and even non-state actors are busy dealing with their own internal issues and not interested in getting involved in any kind of armed conflict. Now, there is something that's not related to coronavirus, but we'll see if maybe it is affected by coronavirus, which is the quote-unquote Trump deal of the century, which Israel is, at least Netanyahu, is pushing the new government to bring about legislation come July, where settlements in the West Bank and the Jordan Valley would be annexed to Israel. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo the U.S. Secretary of State, was just here yesterday and discussing these issues with our political leadership. This can lead to various scenarios. It's very hard to say, but the worst possible case scenario is massive civil unrest among the Palestinians, strong condemnation, if not even worse, from Arab countries that have peace agreements with Israel, specifically Jordan. There is a possibility of even talk about a cancellation of the peace treaty. And it's very hard to say how this will pan out, but it's definitely a potentially explosive issue that could impact Israel's relations with its neighbors on a geostrategic level. One thing that, I mean, this has been more of an internal issue in Israel, but it does in some way relate to Israeli-Arab conflict, or at least Jewish-Arab relations, is that because in Israel, there is a very high proportion of medical workers, doctors, nurses, maintenance staff at hospitals who are from the Arab sector, who are Arabs. There's been a kind of a recognition among the Jewish public of the importance of recognizing the role, the positive role that the Arab sector has in Israeli society. And there's been, to some extent, let's say, a better cooperation, a higher amount of respect, just on a person-to-person level, between Jews and Arabs in Israel, and even to some extent between Israel and the Palestinians in terms of cooperating in certain ways to fight coronavirus. So we have a bit of a mixed bag in Israel in terms of how coronavirus will affect the situation. The economic situation is going to take a while to recover. Also, Israel is very much an export-based economy in terms of exporting to Europe and to other places, be it high-tech, be it agriculture, and so forth. So this is obviously extremely affected by transport and movement issues that have been impacted by Corona. So the economic picture does look somewhat bleak, but politically things will probably be rather stable here, at least from a perspective of the impact of coronavirus. Thank you for listening.